serious. Redditors who have been kidnapped, what was your experience like? Are there things you do now that you would have never done before? Story 1. My father kidnapped me when I was 7, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. I lived with my alcoholic mother and her insane boyfriend. I wasn't physically abused, but looking back, the mental abuse and neglect were very traumatic. There were some borderline child called it things. Anyways, my father had visitation rights and picked me up every other weekend. One weekend, he came to get me and saw that I hadn't eaten much, food was almost always under lock and key, and my mom and her insane boyfriend were nowhere to be found. So my father told me, pack your stuff. We spent some time hiding out at different places with family, friends, even hotels in Laughlin and Vegas. It was like a mini vacation. I even remember staying at my dad's girlfriend's house when the cops showed up. I hid under the bed while they talked to her. At the end of the day, I never had to go back to my mom's boyfriend's house, and my father won majority custody. I'm not sure how I would have turned out if I'd stayed there. Thank you, Dad. Story 2. This happened when I was 6. I come from a third world country, and at the time, kidnappings were at an all-time high. We lived in a fairly nice neighborhood, no kidnappings there, no theft, great neighbors, and we felt pretty safe. Therefore, my mom wasn't too worried. Our house was a gated residence, so we had a front yard and backyard. I was out one morning in the front yard playing with some toys while my mom was inside working or cooking or whatever. Someone knocked on the front gate. Me, being a dumb child, decided to go up and ask who it was. It was this fairly old man who asked for some water. Me, being the nice, helpful child, opened the door and was snatched immediately. I do not particularly remember what happened after that, but I woke up in a compound which I'm pretty sure was far from home. They hadn't done anything bad to me as far as I know, but they did try to feed me food that I didn't like. I was a picky child, and so all I ate was fruit. They had asked for a ransom, which to this day, I don't know how much it was. They just kept me in a room all day with duct tape on my mouth and ropes around my feet and hands. They did take duct tape off to let me drink water or eat food. Anyways, a few days later, the police busted them and arrested them. They ended up in jail for life, which is what I was told. Not too long after that, my parents decided to move to a different country, and now all is well. I still think about what might have gone wrong if they had sold me into child slavery or something. Fairly common in my country. Life resumed after that, and I'm as happy as a 20-year-old can be. Nothing really changed. I still don't know why I was kidnapped, maybe for ransom or whatever. In exactly a month, it'll be my 14th kidnapping anniversary. Story 3. When I was 20, I was stuck at a party with a bunch of drunk people and fights started breaking out. I wanted to go home, but my phone died and I didn't have my keys or wallet on me, so I decided to walk home across town at midnight. I walked most of the way home when I came across a 30-year-old man on a bicycle who was chasing another man on a scooter up the road. Little did I know that he was trying to mug the other guy. I walked faster and kept my head down. The guy rode around the block on his bike, and when he knew I was alone, he jumped off his bike and dragged me into a bush at knife point. He tried to mug me, but when he realized I had nothing on me, he decided he would assault me instead. I convinced him that we would be caught at the side of the road and that he should come home with me. We walked for what seemed like 40 minutes, and he held me by the throat so I couldn't run. We got to a hill, and I offered to push his bike for him as it looked heavy. I kept the bike between us, and when we got to the top, I saw a taxi at the bottom. I threw the bike at him and ran away, screaming assault. I got blisters all over my feet, but I didn't care. All I cared about was escaping. He ran away, and luckily they could gather enough DNA evidence to catch him. He was recently sentenced to 12 years in jail, and I was very lucky. Lesson? Never walk alone at night. Story 4. When I was maybe 10 or 11, my neighbor kidnapped me. She was this single woman in her 50s who was always super nice to me. She was always on her porch and she'd wave when I'd come home from school. Anyway, I was walking home from school and she was waving as usual, but this time she was beckoning me over. So I went up to her porch and she asked me if I wanted some meatloaf she made. I love meatloaf and she seemed harmless, so I said yes. I expected her to come outside with a plate or something, but instead she called me in and told me to sit downstairs. I felt weird about it, but I followed her into her basement and sat down on her couch. She brought me a plate of meatloaf and I watched Pokemon 2000 on VHS. She had a freezer with those 2 popsicle things too. After I ate, I told her I needed to go home and she told me my parents called and asked her to keep me while they ran errands. I felt weird about that and suspected she was lying, but I just went along with it. I remember I asked her if I could get my Game Boy at one point from my house and she said my parents told me to not let me out of her sight. I remember watching Men in Black and falling asleep. When I woke up, I tried leaving, but the door was locked. She left some banana pudding for me on the table for when I woke up, so I just had that and went back to sleep. She opened the door at like 5 in the morning, woke me up, and asked me if I wanted to go home. She looked like she had been crying. I told her yes, and she let me go. My parents asked me where I was, and I just told them I went home with a friend after school. I didn't have a cell phone, so it was pretty normal for me to be gone for a day. I didn't see my neighbor on her porch the next Monday, so I knocked on her door. She came outside and we talked on the porch about stuff. We never talked about that night, and she probably thought I didn't even realize what happened. She didn't say, but I think she had a kid who died a couple of years prior and wanted to fill the gap. I never hated her for it or anything until I moved a couple of years later. I would sit on her porch after school most days and she'd listen to my neat facts about space. Story 5. I'm not sure if this technically counts as kidnapping, but I was held against my will while something terrible happened and I couldn't leave. First off, just to establish that I'm a man in my 30s now, and even though this happened around 20 years ago, it still manages to get me sometimes. Basically, I was 16 years old and had run away from home. Looking back, there wasn't a good reason for me to run away. My childhood wasn't terrible, and I was just acting out because, well, I was a bit of a hardhead back then. On the second night, I found myself in the city center, just sort of wandering around near bars and clubs in awe of the sophisticated young adults who were all dressed and groomed, getting served drinks and basically having fun. A white van pulled up alongside me and there were two guys in it. One of them asked if I wanted to get a drink, and being a naive brain, I told him, yeah, sure. He got out of the van and went inside a bar to get a drink to bring out for me. I was too young to get in or get served. Even for a 16-year-old, I looked really young. Once he was inside the bar, my common sense kicked in, and sensing danger, I walked away. About half an hour goes by and the same guy pulls up beside me. This time he's in a car and his friend is gone. I apologized for taking off and made some excuse for why I did it. Can't remember exactly what I said. He told me not to worry about it, and we started talking. He told me that he owns a fashion store, and if I wanted to, he could get me kitted out at his shop and get me into some really good clubs. Because I was a wit, I thought this sounded like a good idea, and I hopped into his car. And so we get to his store, and needless to say, it was not what he made it out to be. It was in a rough area of the city, and even before he pulled the shutters up, it was obvious that this was some cheap discount sportswear type place. I started to tell him that I changed my mind, and he bundled me inside and pulled and locked the shutters behind us. He started to try and kiss me, and I said either I don't want to or I want to go. He grabbed the back of my hair really hard and pulled my head back and snarled, "Do you want to die? Is that what you want?" I'd never been more scared in my life, and I don't think I have been since. Needless to say, he molested me, and it was brutal. Once it was over, all I could think of to do was be extra nice to him so that I could maybe get out of there alive. He made some comment about having violated me, and I responded with something like, "What are you talking about? You didn't do that. I enjoyed it." I cringe at this now, and even though it was my survival tactic, I still kind of hate myself for saying it. Anyway, like I said, I was super nice and friendly to the point of normalizing what had happened just so that he could trust me enough to let me go. I told him that I was really hungry and asked if we could go get a burger. He said no, and this time I begged him and said I hadn't eaten in days. He reluctantly agreed, opened the door, and started to pull up the shutters. As soon as he did, I bolted as fast as I could, and I didn't look back. I returned home to my family shortly after that. Never told them what happened, though. So, yeah, I'm very cautious and wary of people's motives. I would never completely trust a stranger like I did back then, which isn't a bad thing, I guess. In a way, I was pretty lucky. It could have ended much worse than it did. Story 6. This is a long one, but it gets good. 2 years ago, I was very hungover on a summer Saturday in Manhattan. A girl I was seeing at the time was angrily getting her things together and proceeded to storm out of the apartment, which was shared by myself and 4 other guys. My old roommates had moved to a new apartment the night before, so there were boxes and miscellaneous crap everywhere. I was lying in bed, dying. It was around 9 or 10 a.m. About 5 minutes after the girl stormed out, there was a knock at the door. She must have forgotten her phone charger or something. So I got up in my boxers, walked across the living room where all the unpacked, half-packed stuff was, and opened the door. And behind the door was one of the scariest faces I've ever seen. Very beady eyes, thick mustache, scarred-up face, balding man in his 50s. I was holding the door slightly ajar. Since it wasn't who I thought it was, I stepped behind the door a bit to hide my pale-ass body and stuck my head through the crack. He asked if Billy was home, one of my old roommates. I told him that Billy had moved out the day before. With that said, he put all of his body weight into the door, sending me flying back. This dude was enormous. As I was recovering from this and trying to figure out why someone would be so angry with Billy, this gentleman open hand slapped me so hard I hit the ground. I was now awake. My new house guest identified himself as Big Tony and demanded to speak with Billy. I went into my room, right off of the living room where Big Tony was now setting up shop, and put on pants and grabbed my phone. Tony already had made it very clear not to call the police or try to run out of my apartment, or I might fall out of the window or get shot in the knees. Apparently, Billy owed a lot of money. I called Billy, who said he never heard of Big Tony, and Billy was convinced it was a joke. Tony asked for the phone, and I heard Billy telling Big Tony to go screw himself and to get out of his old apartment. Tony was now upset and started telling Billy that his roommate, myself, might get hurt if he didn't learn some manners and come to the old apartment. Billy hung up. Tony, for some reason, took a liking to me. He apologized for the slap, gave me some cigarettes, and said he hoped that this would all work out. He constantly commented on the fact that I was living like an animal since there was stuff all over the apartment, and asked if me and my old roomies watched betting sports. We never watched sports, never had cable. He asked if Billy's last name was something which it wasn't, and then asked if Billy was from somewhere that he wasn't, and then asked if Billy was enrolled in a university that he wasn't. I informed Big Tony that I was fairly confident he was in the wrong apartment. Just as I was getting him to back off and believe that there might be more than one Billy living in an apartment building, there was another knock at the door. "If it's the cops or your parents, I'm the maintenance guy," I said to my friend as my parents were coming to help me move out that afternoon. I opened the door and saw Henry, another one of my old roommates, walking in to get some things. I told him he had picked a bad time, but he was already inside. Tony pretended to be my uncle for a few minutes, but then I intervened and explained to Henry that the big man with us was looking for Billy, who he believed owed him money. "Henry, do you guys gamble?" I asked. "Yeah, we gamble all the time," he replied. "We often play dice and cards." I tried to explain to Tony that we didn't gamble on sports, but he had to go through the whole thing again. After another half hour of questioning with Henry, Tony realized he was in the wrong apartment. He called his coworker to get a picture texted to him, but it wasn't Billy. I wished Tony good luck and tried to get him to leave, but he insisted on taking Henry and me out for coffee and donuts to apologize. I refused, but Tony wouldn't have it. We ended up at Starbucks, ordering donuts and coffee, which we consumed in a nearby park while listening to Tony's stories. After half an hour, he said we could leave and we headed back. Of course, no one believed us. We had a party in the old and pretty empty apartment. I stayed at a friend's place in the building and woke up to knocks on the door. It was my buddy Tom, who also lived in the building. He told me someone was outside looking for me. I got dressed and went outside to find Big Tony, who gave me a grocery bag filled with beer and cigarettes. Tom and a few other friends from the building came outside and we drank beer in styrofoam cups on the street while listening to Tony's stories. Everyone believed Henry and I, and if I ever found myself in Tony's neighborhood again, he insisted that I call him for dinner on him. Story 7. I was a victim of parental kidnapping as a child. It was terrifying because I knew the situation was wrong and I shouldn't have been with my mother. But even when I could put together words to say that, I was scolded because, "No, that's your mother and your mother can't kidnap you." It was one of many events that made me lose all faith in authority figures. Since it happened when I was young, I don't do anything differently in my life as an adult, but I do get very annoyed when people complain about having to sign out their kid from daycare and face any sort of hurdles when taking their kid out of school or daycare early. Familial kidnapping is real and can be as traumatizing, if not more so, than stranger kidnapping. I was lucky that my mom just wanted her sympathy ticket. Story 8. Not much like the other stories here, but my ex-boyfriend abducted me from my parents' home when I was 19. He threw me in the trunk of his car and drove off. About 8 hours later, a lot happened in between, including me getting out of the trunk and into the back seat. The police spotted his car and engaged in a high-speed pursuit. He crashed into a tree, served about 4 years, and is out with a wife and 3 kids now. It didn't affect me as much as people expected it to, and I didn't really have changed anything in my life because of it. It happened in the past, and that's how I view it. Story 9. Every summer, my brother and I would fly out to Bethel Island, California to stay on my mother's houseboat. It was a place where there were no rules and endless days, and I looked forward to it every year. When I was 7, my mother sued my father for custody of my older brother and me. She lost the case because she falsified child abuse, having coached us to lie. But being too young to fully understand, I told the truth instead. After the court case, she was ordered to hand us back over, but she ran instead. I still remember the phone call we received while waiting at her boathouse. She told us to get our things and flee to the far side of the island where her boyfriend would be waiting with his boat to take us away from everything. Being pragmatic, I stuffed my backpack with Twinkies, knowing there was a good chance we would get hungry. We made it to the boat and snuck across state lines into Arizona, where we stayed on her boyfriend's ranch in the middle of the desert. The place had a table full of playboys, a wall full of guns, and bees everywhere. My mother would leave for days at a time, trying to find a long term place for us to go, but had no luck. Her boyfriend eventually lost patience and they broke up. My mom packed us up again and we moved from one bad situation to another. I could see the toll it was taking on her. After 11 months, we returned to her houseboat because it was the only place to go, but the police knew she would return sooner or later. They instructed the neighbors to call if they saw her, and within hours, several police cars showed up, and my mom was hauled off to jail while my brother and I were moved into foster care. The courts investigated my mother's claims of child abuse, which took several months. Life in foster care was terrifying, humiliating, and degrading. I won't get into the nightmares or the abuse witnessed because people who've been there? No. For the rest, it's probably better you don't. Needless to say, I was immensely relieved when we finally returned to my father. He was a stern disciplinarian, but he backed off some after that experience. How did all of this affect me long term? I just turned 40, and I've never really put down roots. I could be ready to flee my home in less than 20 minutes because living on the move taught me how little possessions matter. This has made forming relationships harder, and I've moved around a lot. Only in the last few years have I really finally started to put down roots, but I still fight the urge to run sometimes. Story 10. My sisters and I were repeatedly kidnapped by our father between the ages of 2 and 4. He would take us from our mother, who had brain damage and a serious drug problem. He beat us if we made noise, locked us in a closet, and forgot to feed us for days at a time. Each kidnapping lasted between 2 weeks and 6 months, depending on how long it took my mother to realize we were gone and ask for help. He was a very scary man who just wanted the money from the state, food stamps, and welfare. He also tried to get money out of my maternal grandmother. In fact, she's the only reason the cops kept getting involved and trying to locate him. She had money and influence and used it. I don't remember much because I was so young, but I remember being scared and in pain and a uniformed cop opening a door and letting light in. I was terrified of being locked in the dark for years after, and sandy-haired men with mustaches can still make me very nervous. I'm 41 now. When I got divorced, my kids were almost the exact same age as my sisters and I when the kidnapping started. It was a struggle to keep those old fears in check. Story 11. I was kidnapped in February of this year by a local gang and held for 95 days. Sunlight, real food, and freedom are what I missed most. The gang had broken into my home last year and stole about 30 to 40 grand, so the leader thought they could get another payday by doing it again this year. Except this year they only found about $1,500 and some weed. I was left free after 95 days. 95 days of being treated like an animal humbles a person. I've changed a lot. I started 2 legitimate businesses as soon as I was let free. I'm going to leave this country at the end of this year, hopefully. Otherwise, I'm positive this gang will come back for a 3rd time. There's no reason they won't if they've already come twice. I'm afraid of what might happen the 3rd time.